so stressed, right? You're just balancing so many things. And then I made a mistake, and I was so hard on myself. I'm like, I should quit the profession. I got some really, really dark thoughts.
Musician, social entrepreneur, lawyer. Stephen has been recognized as one of the top 25 most influential lawyers by Canadian Lawyer magazine, and he has also been honored with the prestigious BC Medal of Good Citizenship for his unwavering advocacy against anti-Asian hate crimes.
The reality is that what's happening is the same thing that's starting to happen now with Asians in general. In the states of Florida and Louisiana, if you have a passport that's a Chinese passport, you can no longer buy property now.
He currently works as a lawyer for Rivian.
Piece of a photo that I'm staring at every single day, right? So these are the 5 images that kind of guide my life.
So just before we begin, we'd like to start off with your origin. So if you were to write an autobiography about yourself, what would be the major chapters in your life that has brought you to the position where you are today?
Oh man, there's so many major chapters. I think there's 2 that I can think of right away. The first is really like going abroad and studying abroad in Singapore during my exchange years. That's one big one. And also the second big chapter is actually going back to my homeland. So I'm part Vietnamese, part Chinese, and I had an opportunity to work in Vietnam in 2017. And that really transformed my perspective in my life. So yeah, those are the 2 big ones. I'm sure there's other big ones, but those are the 2 ones that stand out to me right away.
Okay. And from these experiences, how do you feel like you developed? What did you bring in from these experiences?
Yeah, for sure. So from the first experience, I really felt like I grew. I think living abroad and living by myself for a year really taught me how to really make friends. I think from that time, it was my first time being in a new place, having no friends or family around me, and really pushing the boundaries and trying new things. Definitely it was hard in the beginning. First of all, like I grew up in Canada. I'm used to the cold weather, and living in Southeast Asia where it's incredibly hot and sweaty. It was definitely uncomfortable. So definitely not only were there differences in the climate, but also in the culture. But at the same time, I think I learned so much in terms of what it's like to grow and make new friends and really push my comfort zone, honestly. And that's probably the biggest thing. And since then, it's been a lot. I think, honestly, my personality changed because I became a lot more willing to take risks, a lot more willing to just meet people just randomly. And it really helped really pivot my life, I would say so.
Yeah, I think it's so funny that you say that because even for me, I was born in Montreal and then I decided to make the move to Vancouver. And for me, it was definitely the biggest decision I made in my life to that moment, but it turned out to be one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. And so I think often when you ask people that have gone on exchange or have gone abroad or have gone far away from home, they often relay this experience that, oh my God, it was like one of the best decisions ever, right? I think there's only a few cases where some people might say something against that. And I'm wondering, why do you think going outside of your comfort zone tends to be such a revelation for us as humans or humans living in society? And why are we also at the same time so afraid to take those decisions sometimes, even though they bring such great benefit in the long run?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing that I want to take it back to is just an analogy that I heard where, as humans, we are life, right? If you look at plants and creatures, when you have them in the same environment the entire time, they don't quite grow or expand, but when you add different elements to it, it encourages them to grow and become stronger. And so similarly, like if we're in the same environment our entire lives, we end up in this like one-sided dimension, but we're subject to different elements, different stressors. Obviously there's a balance, right? You're not going to be throwing something deep in the ocean, but at the same time, like think of a tree that's never been exposed to wind, right? And who's been like that for like 20 years. Although we try to protect that tree, but once it hits any moment of wind, it's going to topple over. And unfortunately, that's really the case for many situations where if you're not exposed to stressors, you aren't able to grow those roots, that ability to resist and have that well-being. So I think, these are important things to think about. I think that obviously there's a balance between it, but just imagine this is what's reflected in the environment, and similar can happen to us as well as humans.
Okay. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that point. For me, growing up, I was really shy. I wasn't confident with public speaking at all. And from my parents, I understood that if I wanted to grow, if I wanted to be a more confident speaker, I had to go out, put myself in these difficult situations step outside my comfort zone before I can grow into a person that I want to see myself as. And I know you studied science and minored in commerce during your time at UBC. However, I noticed on your LinkedIn profile that afterwards you took a more business related job. Why did you decide to go in the commerce direction? Was it also to like
Oh, that's a
step
really good.
outside your comfort zone?
Yeah, I mean that's a really great question, Brandon. I started in science because I was following the path of going into pre med and medical school,
Mm.
and it wasn't
Hmm.
until like partway through I did some volunteer work in South America. I'm like, this is not for me. Like, this is definitely not for me. Like, can you imagine? I spent like a good 10 years trying to prepare for this moment. And then I did my actual first time volunteering in a hospital, and it's like, dang, this is not the right path at all. And it was a moment of revelation. It's like, okay, I got to switch things up. And so definitely, I finished my science degree. I did my minor in commerce just to find a way to kind of add some business courses. And from there, I jumped into that world. But, it sounds easy. When we looked at LinkedIn profiles, and I'm guilty of this too, right? It seems like a straight path, but really it isn't. There's months of agony, my friends. Like, it was months and months of agony because suddenly my friends, my families, my colleagues are like, wait, Steven, I thought you were going to medical school. I thought you were going to become a doctor. I'm like, no, actually, I'm going to go straight into marketing. They're like, it was just confusing. But, the one thing that I grasped from all this is that, there's this story that society paints, right? And there's this picture. And, it's so easy for us to let that shape our direction. In some senses, it might even force us to go down a path we didn't want to go down. And there's very common instances of this. But I think at the end of the day, you got to follow what's right for you. Like, what is your intuition telling you? What is your truth? Because that's what matters the most. And yeah, there is going to be moments of resistance. And I definitely felt that. And so, yeah, it's a good question there, Brandon. It definitely was a moment of reckoning for me during that time.
Yeah. And during that time, I believe you've also like questioned yourself, wondered if it's the right step for you. And that's kind of a period I'm going through right now because I'm also curious to become a lawyer and go to law school and pursue that career. However, I haven't really had any real world experience with it. And I'm wondering if I'm like idealizing that career and that lifestyle. So, what kind of questions did you ask yourself to like introspect and reflect who you are before making the decision to pursue that commerce role?
Yeah, I mean, I'll address your first comment. Yeah, it's just like TV, okay? Just kidding. Don't follow what TV says about
Yeah.
about being a lawyer. When I made the decision to be a lawyer, it was actually even like later on, like after the commerce side of it. And so happy to share that in later on in the discussions. But I think the biggest thing is just like having time and sitting with yourself to think about what energizes you and what doesn't. Sometimes we get quite distracted, right, with social media. And I'm guilty of this too, by the way, right? TV shows, like consuming content. But at the end of the day, there's so much value in actually just being by yourself. And just put yourself for an hour, 2 hours, sit in a coffee shop, sit in a park, somewhere completely different. Ideally, someplace that's very different from where you are, because your brain is like, whoa, where am I right now? Have a pen and paper, like mute all your electronics and just write. Write down like what energizes me, what doesn't. And when you use that moment, you can really think about, okay, this might work, and then use that. How do I figure the path forward? So in your case, Brandon, if you want to be a lawyer, I think the first question is actually talk to lawyers, right? How do they look? Do they seem happy? Do they seem like they hate their lives, right? And talk to a bunch of them, okay? Like some lawyers are pretty miserable. I get that, right? And sorry, my lawyer friends who are listening to this, but like take a sample of people that I kind of want to be in that position and learn from them. That's the best position to understand and learn.
It seems like you practice a lot of self-awareness from what you're saying, Stephen. Is there any main ones? I'm guessing you journal based on what you were saying there. Do you journal in any particular way? I'm always curious to see how people work on self-awareness. I think there's definitely many techniques, and I'm wondering which types did you develop over the years? I journal myself, so I know that's a great one.
Yeah, journaling is fantastic. I'm just looking out from my journal. I was even writing this morning, right? I think like what I do is I'm just showing those on the screen, right? I just literally put pen to paper. I just literally open a page of book and I try to finish at least one page of my journal. And then ideas will start showing up and I'll write it down on the left hand side. And these ideas might not even be related to what I'm journaling about, to be honest, but it's just free form. I just force myself to start writing. And so, for example, even the entry from today is like, oh, good morning. I'm writing this again. Okay, here we go, right? I just write. And I think from there, you get some really interesting ideas that show up. And so that's usually what I think about. I think the biggest thing is that just having space to yourself. I think we can get so overwhelmed and distracted. And don't get me wrong, it's great to have influences and inspirations, but that needs to be counterbalanced with time for ourselves. When we have the two of them, then we can make some really powerful decisions.
Hmm.
Yeah. It seems like when you journal, you put down ideas and you force yourself to think. And I'm curious, is that kind of what motivated you to co-found Beyond DA for with the focus of destigmatizing anxiety in the legal profession?
Yeah, great question. I think Beyond the A was very much something that was born out of a crisis in my life. And so, short story here. When I was practicing over in Vietnam, I was doing a lot of corporate M&A, and I was going through some really tough times. It was super stressful. Like there was not enough lawyers staffed in the firm, and I was getting swamped left and right by deals. And at that time, I started to get very miserable. I started to be very cranky. I started to be not myself, essentially. And these are all signs of depression, all signs of anxiety. And there became a moment when I made a mistake on a file because I was so stressed, right? You're just balancing so many things. And then I made a mistake and I was so hard on myself. I'm like, I should quit the profession. I got some really, really dark thoughts. And I was like, man. And what happened after that is that I tried to look online for resources, looked on my internal law firm website to find any resources, but there wasn't anything. The only thing at that time was how do you identify anxiety and depression in other people? It was as if this is like a foreign thing that doesn't really apply to anybody, and it was so stigmatized. And so in essence, I thought, you know what, I'm going to change this. Why don't I create an organization, create a nonprofit that addresses this directly and invite people to speak about their experiences, invite, psychiatrists, invite friends, invite others. And the moment I started to come up with this idea and share it with the world, I got flooded with messages from friends and colleagues and even mentors of mine who mentioned that, hey, Stephen, you're actually doing something really powerful here because it's not talked about in the profession. So a lot of these ideas are coming from moments of like my own pain and how do I find a way to kind of pivot through. So that's really what inspired Beyond the A.
Wow. That seems really, really impressive how you're so able to like turn something from a deep dark moment of yours into something that's helping a bunch of other people. Would you describe yourself as social entrepreneur, someone who seeks out to create something better for the world?
Yeah, I think the best way to create something is usually when you're faced with some kind of pain in yourself. That is the best way to create it because you're like, how do I teach my younger self, right? How do I showcase and guide my own, younger Steven? So, for Beyond the A, I'm creating something that I wish I had when I first went through the journey. And this is like trickled through many moments of my life. And even now, I run a podcast called Two Dads, One Car. I don't think two of you guys have kids at the moment. Not, yes, probably not. Right? But
I know.
surprise, surprise. But this was also driven from, I have a 2-year-old daughter, but before she was about to get born, I was looking for books and resources, and everything was written from the mother's perspective, which is fine. Don't get me wrong. I think that's absolutely important. But there was nothing out there from the father's perspective, right? Every book I was reading related to, how do you feed your baby? I obviously don't feed a baby, right? Not naturally, at least. And so there wasn't anything. And I'm like, okay, here's an opportunity here to tap into this market. And so I essentially, I was so fed up with the lack of materials out there that I was like, let me just invite 10 of my friends who are fathers and just ask them questions. And you know what? Guys love driving. So I had them sitting next to me and we just talked about fatherhood for like 30 minutes. We popped by a coffee shop, like a drive-thru to pick up something from McDonald's. And I learned so much in those 10 episodes that I could have never learned on books or websites.
The crazy thing there that you mentioned is, again, it's how communication solved like one of your issues or helped you communicate with parenting. And then again, you mentioned how when you're in that like darker moment and in the lawyership, what actually got you out of it, it's starting to speak again. And that relates directly back to, we're not giving ourselves time away from like our phones and we're just so glued to like our screens and we're constantly bombarded with activities and entertainment that I think not only are we losing time with ourselves, but we're probably also losing times with others, right?
Yeah, this is a huge problem, right? If you think about, have the two of you watched like Wall-E, the that movie
Yeah,
Disney
yeah, yeah,
movie.
yeah.
Mhm.
Like those who are listening, you remember that scene where everybody's just glued to their screens and literally moving around on these like machines. This is
Mhm.
exactly what's happening right now, right? This is what we're seeing in the world where people are glued to their phones, their devices. They're not moving. And so, objectively speaking, if you look at the statistics in the United States, people weights are going higher and higher and higher. Deaths are happening early, like mortality is even earlier. So this is a massive problem that we're seeing from this movie. I watched it again couple months ago just to remind myself about
Mm.
what can go wrong. And this is happening when we don't have time to ourselves to think, to reflect, to go in nature. I think that is the antidote. That's how we can help, get clarity in our lives.
So, Stephen, I kind of want to ask you, if you were Prime Minister of the world or President of the world, what would you implement to help that
Oh,
issue?
oh my God. If I was president, that first of all, that I don't know who would give me that power. I feel bad if anyone were to give me that ability, right? Honestly, I think if everyone was to carve out 10 minutes of the day in the morning just to focus on themselves, the world can be a really quickly a better
Mm.
place. If you listen to even the craziest moments, you think about the Cuban Missile Crisis or moments of history, these presidents and prime ministers got clarity in their thinking just from walking from place to place. You read that in books from Lincoln, you hear that in history from Kennedy. Like they got their thoughts from actually walking or having time to themselves. I think if each one of us carves out just 10 minutes just to ourselves in the beginning, a lot can change. Because oftentimes, and I'm guilty of many things, okay? I'm here not to preach, okay? I've made all these mistakes. But times when I made the most terrible decisions is when I was rushed and I didn't have time to think to myself. And that's when, bad decisions can happen. So I think, having the ability to carve out time, even 10 minutes, can actually make a big difference.
Mm.
Time is a very scarce commodity. And you mentioned having like 10 minutes in the morning to have to yourself and to do some reflection and thinking. But I know you're involved with a lot of things outside of your advocacy work, and you work on your community. You have Beyond the A and organizations like that. Do you have tips for people who want to make a positive impact outside of their professional roles and have them be able to like carve out time? Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, so I think there's this notion that time is finite. I mean, sure it is, right? Objectively speaking, but I think it's about what you do with the time that you have, right? I think ultimately, you the point is not to cram your entire day with stuff, right? But more toward is just being really mindful and being really attentive and being understanding about what these moments are. I think here's an example to kind of crystallize it, right? Imagine you're going for dinner with a friend and you spend half the time looking at your phone, right? That
Mhm.
that 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 dinner is actually not that fulfilling. And so instead, if you put the phone away, if you actually just focus on each other, you can actually get a lot out of those moments. And so I think part of quote unquote carving out time is actually being mindful of your time. That's a better way of describing it. Because when we're mindful of our time, we can actually get quite a lot of things done. And more importantly, I think it's important to understand like what actually energizes you. Even this whole notion of goal setting, like it's a myth to be honest with you, because like we're so conditioned to like chase certain titles and certain goals. But more importantly, I think more important is understanding like what kind of life do you want to have and working backwards from there.
Mm.
Because if your goal is to make $1 million a year, sure you could do it, but you might be a slave to your job, right? Is that kind of life you want? Instead, rather want to plan out your life and go backwards from there. I think that's the key point of it all.
Mm.
And is that what you have done with your career? Have you like mapped what careers you want, what kind of lifestyle you want, and then matched it to what you're working on right now? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just like grab you, like just on the side of my screen here, I have my vision board. Let me just pull it off just to show the audience here. So I have a piece of a photo that I'm staring at every single day, right? There are 5 images on here. So those who are just doing audio only, 5 images. One's being like a home that's floor to ceiling windows with it. Looks pretty nice. One is like speaking career. One is hanging out with friends. One's flying. One's with my family, right? And so these are the 5 images that kind of guide my life because this is kind of life that I want to have. And from there, I work backwards. Does what I'm doing contribute to these 5 things? I think being on this podcast does, because it contributes to right here, right? Becoming a better speaker.
Mm.
And so, but if there's things that don't align to these 5 images, I say no right away. And so when you have that intentionality, it can make decisions really easy, right? And my images are different from yours. Everyone has a different set of images, but when you have that kind of guiding system, it can really make things a lot easier to decide upon.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even when, me and Brandon speak, I think we give ourselves time to sometimes imagine even where this podcast can be like, oh my God, why not like have Barack Obama at some point or, like some insane people, right? Because I think it's so important to have that vision because it allows you then your mind to focus on, well, how can we actually carve a path to get there? And you mentioned intentionality there. When I went on your website, in a very specific order, it says musician, social entrepreneur, and lawyer. Is there a reason for that order? I'd imagine there is.
Yeah, for sure. I think when people see the word lawyer, there's already a preconceived notion of who this person is. And so that's why I put it at the very end, right? I think it's so easy to label people like, oh, you're a lawyer, you're a doctor, you're an accountant. And you have this whole preconceived notion. And so the ordering of the word matters, right? You put it at the very end to be like, whoa, where did that come from? Music is definitely a big part of who I am. I just did a big show yesterday. I just feel so much joy and energy out of it. Helping the world with being a social entrepreneur. That's a big part of it as well. And the last one, like, I don't want to dismiss my career, right? I'm a lawyer, right? I think I did really well, right? And that taps into a very logical side of my brain. And so I have the creative side and I have the logical side, and I actually do both, I think, quite well. And I need both to actually really thrive. And so, yeah, I have that as an order for two reasons, really. One being really just to avoid the automatic bucketing of people that we meet, and the second to capture really the broader scheme of who I am as a person.
Right now, you're the advisory director and former president of the Federation of Asian Lawyers, BC, and you work towards unbucketing and getting rid of the stereotype that people that are lawyers look a certain way and are a certain type. And I'm wondering, what are you pursuing right now? What are some goals of the organization, and what are you guys trying to achieve in the end?
Yeah, the deeper goal that we're working on as a board is how do we create a place of belonging? Really create a place of belonging for those who are Asian Canadian, that they feel part of this community. And more important, how to carve out a space for us within the legal profession as a whole. Brandon, you talked about how there's this preconceived notion of what a lawyer is. 30 years ago, no one would imagine me to be a lawyer, right? Like I'm Asian, obviously, right? I don't sound like a lawyer. I don't look like a lawyer, but that's the problem, though, right? There are these preconceived systemic barriers that are in place. And so that's one aspect of it. And the second aspect that I'm really working on is that I truly think that we're at this inflection point in history where it's now honestly, sorry, Adam, but it's kind of cool to be Asian now, right? Like we live in Vancouver, like you have K-pop, you have kimchi, like pho is now like $20 a bowl. It's insane. Like this everything is like coalescing in media and politics, in sports, but law is lagging behind. And so I think there's an opportunity for all of us to step into it and really help change society, adjust the policies, because this really matters. Like, to me, I'm deeply troubled about what I'm seeing in the future, right? I don't know, the two of you have read Ray Jolly's books, but he talks about in the moments of rising geopolitical tensions, you start seeing social strife and you start seeing laws coming in place that are limiting the freedoms of certain individuals. So we have to work towards that and really help shape society for better.
Mm-hmm. And I understand your organization works with people that are already in law school and certified lawyers. But is the organization doing anything that are helping people who aspire to be lawyers? Are there people who are still in secondary school or have just entered university, and are they able to get involved with that federation?
Yeah, for sure. So our mandate for FACL BC is to promote equity, justice, and opportunity for Asian Canadian legal professionals and the wider community. And so really the wider community is how do we give back to the community? How do we contribute, whether it's through legal clinics, whether it's through educational talks in high schools or universities, whether it's like providing our support and advocating for those beyond the profession. So absolutely, right? I think there's definitely we're all in this together. I think as lawyers, we hold this place in society where we can actually influence and really step into what we're seeing down the pipeline. I think the profession is such a fascinating profession, and the reality is that it doesn't take much to really make changes. I think there's a lot of things happening. I don't know, the two of you have been following what's happening in the US, but there's a term and phrase I like to talk about where history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. We all saw what happened to the Japanese, Canadians, and Americans during World War II, right? During World War II, Japanese, Canadians, and Americans were interned. They lost their property rights, and they're basically ostracized, and that was supported by the system. And mainly because there weren't any Japanese or Asian lawyers at the time who it would say, no, this is not right. The reality is that what's happening is the same thing is starting to happen now with Asians in general. In the states of Florida and Louisiana, if you have a passport that's a Chinese passport, you can no longer buy property now. I kid you not. So these laws are starting to come in place. It already passed in Florida and Louisiana. You're seeing that coming in more and more states in the United States. This is not just an American thing. You're starting to see this now in Canada. Very, very important organizations like Success and others are being accused of spying for the Chinese government. And so it's even more imperative now that we all step into this. Like, hey, this is not right. Like, property rights are a fundamental part of who we are. And so that's why it's really important that we really think about this and be really intentional about this.
I think you're kind of making me realize the spectrum of what it means to be a lawyer, like how there's different aspects to it. Like you being a lawyer and, helping out Rivian right now, like that seems super cool. But then at the same time, you're shedding light on, well, actually being a lawyer is super important because there's some super dangerous laws that are starting to happen and we need to take care of that. So I like that spectrum of your job. And I'm sure you find some type of drive and fulfillment in having such a broad aspect job and being able to do different things.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really well said there, Adam, right? I mean, part of it is really driven by, I'm first generation lawyer. Like my parents had no conception about what it's like to be a lawyer. And they had to endure a lot of racist laws and policies and comments just so we can get to where we are. And so I think it's imperative for us and also for our allies and supporters to say, hey, this is not right, right? This policy coming in place, this is quite racist actually. And so when we have people in positions of influence, we could actually make a difference in society. And that's why I think it's important, right? It's one thing to be good at your job, but if you have an additional element, if each one of us takes that one extra step to support and help others, we could actually make a big difference. At the end of the day, we all just want a society that's safe and welcoming. I think all British Columbians want that. We want to be a place where we're not judged by the color of our skin. We can actually walk out to get groceries and not feel attacked. I think we all want a society like that. And so I think it's important that we all do it together because, why not? Otherwise, we can go down a really bad place, and it's more important that we do it now.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more.
And Stephen, as we're coming to an end of our talk, we have this tradition on our podcast where we share a quote from the previous guest, and we'd like to get your thoughts on it. So this quote is coming from someone in the wealth management industry. And the quote goes, "Success is something small repeated day in, day out." What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I love that quote. I'm actually going to start writing it down. But, there's a couple of amazing books called The Compound Effect and The Slight Edge. These are books that really, I'd say transform the way I think about life and success. And a big concept is like, small little things built up over time can lead to tremendous success. And also, small little things that are bad over time can actually lead to tremendous failure.
Sure.
I think that's a very important quote to think about and a good reminder.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen.
Absolutely happy to be.
Thank you so much for making it to the end of this episode. As a growing channel, it would be so amazing if you would take one more minute of your day to reshare this episode on any platform you're liking. Hope to see you next week.